Right now, I am standing in the very heart and center of the Brazilian city of Porto Alegre. This is the fifth largest city in the country of Brazil, with roughly 4.3 million people living in the metropolitan area. The largest cities in Brazil, of course, being Sao Paulo number one, Rio de Janeiro number two, Belo Horizonte number three, the capital of Brasilia being number four, with just a few 100,000 people more in the area than here in Porto Alegre. And then finally here, Porto Alegre, the fifth largest city. Although Porto Alegre is not very famous outside of Brazil, you may have never heard of it before. Like I said, it is in fact the fifth largest city. It's a major city in terms of the Brazilian economy. It's the southernmost major city in Brazil, the capital of the southernmost state, that is Rio Grande do Sul. That's where we are right now. And we are in Praça da Matriz. That is one of the main historic plazas here in the city of Porto Alegre. Porto Alegre, of course, meaning happy port in Portuguese. There is a major river here, and then there's a lake over there, and that is where the name of this city comes from. Now, it's no longer a major port. That has been moved to other facilities, like Rio Grande, I think, is the name of the major port now here in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. But historically, when the ships were smaller, this was the major port of the region. And right behind me is actually the Legislative Assembly of the state of Rio Grande do Sul. Their flag, somewhat iconic here in the state. You will see it around quite a bit. The red, green, and yellow. And then the name of this building, this palace, is Palácio Farroupilha. My Portuguese pronunciation, of course, very poor, but that is a reference to what we call in English the Ragamuffin War. That was when, after Brazil became independent from Portugal in the 1820s, the south of Brazil, which had a very different culture and demography than the rest of Brazil, wanted to be independent, or at least some of the residents here wanted to be independent. And so they fought a war that lasted about 10 years. We call it in English the Ragamuffin War, but in Portuguese it's the Farroupilha War. And so many people here in the South like to refer to themselves as, Farroupilhos or whatever. It's kind of a point of pride. Although they, of course, did lose the war, and the South, Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, they were integrated into the rest of Brazil. But it's still a point of pride here, so you'll see it around. Now, if we move over here, we can see the Metropolitan Cathedral of Rio Grande do Sul. This is one of the most important Catholic churches in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, arguably the most important, as it is the administrative center of the diocese. So yeah, beautiful historic building. I was in there just a couple of days ago. Very nice. A lot of Brazilians have something of a negative perception of Porto Alegre. The city is perhaps not thriving as much now as it was historically. There was really brutal floods here a year ago, actually the worst floods in Brazil in living memory. The river, there was kind of an atmospheric confluence, and 3 months worth of rain fell in something like less than 10 days. And so there was a massive sea level rise, or water level rise, along the river and the lake that Porto Alegre is built along. And so a lot of the historic center was flooded. A lot of the poorer areas to the north of here were flooded. Really brutal floods. A little less, something like 80 people died, a little less than 100 people died, and there was billions of dollars worth of damage. The city is still recovering from that. But even before that happened, the city was in something of a decline, or at least a period of stasis, especially as compared to the other major cities of the south, like Florianopolis and Curitiba. And having been in Curitiba and Florianopolis, I can say that there is more new construction, there is more energy, more vibrancy than here in Porto Alegre. You don't see that much construction here, so it definitely does seem to be a city that is not quite having the as good of a future as perhaps some other cities in Brazil. But I will say, being here, I find it to be a very pleasant place, very quiet, very orderly. The people are respectful. So I don't really know why Brazilians have a negative opinion of Porto Alegre. I personally like it. I like it quite a bit. A lot of Brazilians, when I said that I was coming here to Porto Alegre, they go, "Why are you coming here? What's the point? What's there to see?" And it's like, well, it's the fifth largest city in Brazil. I'm sure there's something to see in the fifth largest city. So I don't know. I'm enjoying it. I like it. I recommend coming here if you're in the south of Brazil, but that's just me. Now, anyway, here in the south of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul especially, you will find a very different culture than you will in the rest of Brazil. In fact, Rio Grande do Sul is arguably the least Brazilian part of Brazil. I remember when I came here, I saw there were so many people drinking mate, which is a tea. You put hot water into yerba mate, and then you get a tea, with caffeine. And people drink it out of these wood cups with metal spoons, and then they will carry around a metal container with more hot water so as to put into the mate as they drink throughout the day. And you'll see a lot of people sitting in parks, sitting in front of their house, and they'll just be drinking mate, throughout the afternoon, and it's a big part of the culture. And as an American, before coming here to South America, the southern part of South America, I associated mate with the Argentinians. I thought it was the only Argentinians, and I didn't realize that in fact here in the far south of Brazil, in Uruguay, in Paraguay, even parts of Chile, they drink mate as well. They don't just drink it, they produce it. Something like a quarter of the world's mate is produced actually here in Brazil. So it's really fascinating. When I first came to southern Brazil and I saw people drinking mate, I thought that they were Argentinian tourists. But then I heard them speaking Portuguese and I realized, oh, wait a second, they're not Argentinians, they're Brazilians. But yet the mate culture exists here as well. Now, part of the reason why the mate culture exists, that kind of more kind of pan, southeastern South America culture exists, is because we're in a region called the Pampas. Now, the Pampas are mostly in Argentina. Pampas, these are fertile subtropical grasslands. These are mostly in Argentina, but they also come into Uruguay and here into Rio Grande do Sul as well. And so that culture of European immigration, of agricultural production, of beef production, as well as the drinking of mate, that actually exists throughout the Pampas region. It's really fascinating to see how many cultural similarities, cultural, demographic, architectural, historical similarities exist between here in the far south of Brazil and neighboring countries like Argentina and Uruguay. And one of those very interesting similarities is a culture known as the Gaucho culture. Now, Gaucho, and we'll walk here into the sunlight in the middle of the square so we can see a little bit more of the city. Now, the Gaucho culture, these are known as kind of rugged horsemen. The Gauchos were largely mestizos, but also Europeans who lived in these kind of rough, unregulated border regions that existed between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Because remember that the New World was originally carved up by the Pope, separated. There was a line of demarcation with a Portuguese area in the east and a Spanish area in the west, and it was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. But the Treaty of Tordesillas was very vague. It wasn't really followed by either side, and so the border between areas of Spanish control and Portuguese control was very blurry, and nobody really knew where it was. And so in these rough, rugged frontier regions with few people, there emerged this kind of rugged, individualistic, scrappy horseman culture, the Gaucho culture. And the Gaucho culture now, of course, there's not that many, horsemen living out in the countryside, sleeping under the stars, but that culture was made famous by South American writers, and mostly Argentina, but also places like Uruguay and here in the far south of Brazil. And so the Gaucho has become kind of an iconic symbol of not just Argentina and Uruguay, but also here in the far south of Brazil, where instead of, most of Brazil, especially along the coastal regions to the north of here, you're going to see a lot of kind of tropical forest and very rugged rolling hills. But here in the south, you don't have the tropical forest. It's a subtropical climate with marked differences between the seasons. It's fall right now. Today is pretty warm. It's the middle of fall, the middle of autumn. It's pretty warm today, but other days that I've been here, the evenings especially have been quite cold. You need a jacket. You see a lot of people walking around in jacket and pants. So there's noticeable differences in the seasons here. It's a fertile grassland. It's flat. So it's very different climatically, geographically, culturally than the rest of Brazil. Now, here in the south of Brazil, in the far south of Brazil, those southern states, you have a very different demographic than the rest of Brazil. Here in the south, the state of Rio Grande do Sul, the population is more than 3/4 European, with Africans, Amerindians, and even a few Asians here and there making up the remaining quarter of the population. But the vast majority of the people here in Rio Grande do Sul are European. And when I walk around here, I do see there's quite a few people who look even like me, people who came from places like Germany and Poland, who immigrated here to southern Brazil. We forget that it wasn't just the United States and Canada that received large amounts of European immigration. It was also here in Brazil, as well as Argentina, Uruguay, that also received a lot of European immigration. And most of the European immigrants who came to Brazil for things like free land and economic opportunity came in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and they settled here in southern Brazil because there was very few people living here. The climate is more subtropical, more similar to what we Europeans are used to, especially Europeans who are from Europe. And so they settled here in large numbers. And so if the kind of core identity of the country of Brazil could be defined as a fusion of Portuguese culture and then the kind of African culture of the many millions of slaves they brought here, and that fusion results in kind of the modern Brazilian identity, the south of Brazil, the far south of Brazil, really stands out as being very culturally dissimilar to the rest of Brazil, with a identity that was much more formed by those waves of millions of Germans, Italians, Poles, even Spanish, kind of mixing with that pre-existing Afro-Portuguese culture and forming something new. And so it is very culturally distinct to the rest of Brazil, and that's why there's, of course, a movement for independence of the south of Brazil. There's been multiple wars fought against Brazil for independence, and that's why it does feel so different than the rest of Brazil. Very fascinating. I haven't been to the far north of Brazil, but I have a feeling that Rio Grande do Sul might be the least Brazilian feeling part of Brazil. I must say it's very fascinating. There's times when I feel like I'm back in Argentina when I walk around here. It's really fascinating. Although the people speak Portuguese, it is like the rest of Brazil. It is a very monolingually Portuguese speaking place, but it almost feels like Argentinians speaking Portuguese sometimes. It's very fascinating. A lot of Brazilians from the north of Brazil would probably hate to hear me say that, but then a lot of Brazilians from the south of Brazil would probably love to hear me say that. So there is a lot of tension in Brazil, with Brazilians from the rest of the country having a bit of an antagonistic relationship with the Brazilians from the far south, because there is, like I said, those major differences. And so this does create resentment and a general sense of antagonism between this area and the rest of Brazil. Very fascinating. Well, there's not much more to say. We'll just briefly walk here into the center of the square. There's a really beautiful monument. Something I've noticed as well in Brazil is that there's not nearly as many kind of classical European style monuments with statues and such as you would see in a place like Argentina or even Chile. And that's because, like I said, Brazil, in its more modern conception of itself, wants to have a more progressive, modernistic, it's less into that classical architecture that you would see in, like, say, Argentina. But here in Rio Grande do Sul, there is, as you can see, there is more of an emphasis upon classical architecture and more European styles of construction that are going to be a little bit less popular in other parts of Brazil. In Brazil, they like to have these kind of modernistic Oscar Niemeyer style, smooth lines, concrete. They view it as being more Brazilian, uniquely Brazilian in character, as opposed to just kind of copies of the European style that you would see in England or Italy or Spain or Portugal. But But yeah, as we can see here, emerging, we have this beautiful monument. It's probably 15th of November, 1839, I think is what it says. So I would assume this is a monument to the war that was fought against Brazil for independence of the South here. So yeah, you can see it's very much built in the European style. There's the Palace of Justice here, which I believe is the Supreme Court of Rio Grande do Sul. You're gonna have to fact check me on that. I looked it up on Google Maps, but I couldn't find what it was. But yeah, this is the Palace of Justice. So you can see this this female holding a sword. This is kind of an icon of Rio Grande do Sul, of Porto Alegre. I've seen it all around. I don't know what it means, but I've seen it around quite a bit. So it's clearly an icon of some kind. But yeah, I think that'll pretty much cover things. I must say, I've really enjoyed my time here in Rio Grande do Sul, here in the south of Brazil. It really is such a very unique part of Brazil. It really is so different than the rest of Brazil. And it really is fascinating. When the Spanish Empire collapsed, the Spanish colonies here in the New World, in the Americas, they split into many, many different countries. Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, many more. Many, many different countries. But the Portuguese colonies, the Portuguese settlement, stayed one single country, Brazil, unified. Really, it's quite an achievement, but it also means that because Brazil is so big, it is much more diverse within the country itself than those other parts of Latin America, those many, many, many Hispanic countries. And so if Brazil was to have, if the Portuguese parts, if Brazil was to have split into multiple parts when Portuguese rule here collapsed, I think that the South would have been probably one of the most likely contenders for being separate. So yeah, it really does almost feel like a different country when you're here. It's very, very fascinating. And of course, I like the more mild climate as well. It's more similar to where I'm from. But yeah, I think that about covers it. Anyway, from here in beautiful Porto Alegre, in Rio Grande do Sul, in beautiful southern Brazil. I'll catch you next time. Ciao.